The wind howled across the prairie like a restless spirit, bending the tall grass and rattling the shutters of the small ranch house that stood alone under the darkening sky. Inside, Lila tightened her shawl around her shoulders and stirred the embers in the fireplace, the only warmth in the empty room. Years had passed since her husband's death, and the silence of the house had become as familiar to her as the creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. She was used to solitude, to the endless work of tending the ranch alone, to the quiet meals eaten with only the flickering fire for company. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and cold, splattering against the windows like impatient fingers tapping for entry. Lila crossed the room to latch the shutters, her hands moving with the quick efficiency of someone who had long since learned to rely on herself. The storm had been building all afternoon, rolling in from the west with a sky so bruised and swollen it promised more than just rain. She had seen storms like this before, the kind that could flood creeks, knock down fences, and leave a person stranded for days. She had just turned away from the window when a sound cut through the wind, not thunder, but the unmistakable rhythm of hoofbeats. Many of them. Lila froze, her breath catching in her throat. No one came this far out unless they had reason, and reason these days was rarely good. Her hand drifted toward the rifle above the fireplace, her fingers brushing the worn wood of the stock. She wasn't a woman who startled easily, but neither was she foolish enough to ignore the prickle of warning along her spine. The riders emerged from the storm like shadows given form, their horses lathered and weary, their cloaks dark with rain. 7 of them. Men, no, warriors, their proud bearing and the way they carried themselves marking them as Comanche even before she saw the intricate beadwork on their saddles. Lila's grip tightened on the rifle. She had heard stories, of course, tales of raids and battles, of settlers who vanished into the wilderness. But these men didn't look like raiders. They looked exhausted, their faces lined with weariness, their horses stumbling in the mud. The leader dismounted first, his boots sinking into the sodden earth as he stepped forward. He was tall, his shoulders broad beneath the damp hide of his coat, his eyes sharp even in the fading light. He raised a hand, palm open, in a gesture that might have been peace or surrender. "We mean no harm," he said, his voice deep and steady despite the wind. "The storm drives us. We ask for shelter." Lila hesitated. Every instinct told her to shut the door, to bar it and wait for them to leave. But the rain was coming down in sheets now, and the wind was so strong it threatened to tear the shingles from the roof. These men would not last the night out there, not without fire, not without dry ground. And though she had lived in fear of strangers for years, she had also lived with the weight of loneliness, and that, too, was its own kind of storm. After a long moment, she stepped back, her free hand pushing the door wider. "The barn's dry," she said, her voice barely louder than the rain. "You can stay there." The warrior Tohanu, though she wouldn't learn his name until morning, dipped his head in thanks. His men followed, leading their horses toward the shelter she had offered. Lila watched them go, her heart pounding, her fingers still curled around the rifle. She didn't know then that this night would change everything. That these strangers, with their quiet strength and unspoken honor, would become more than just a passing shadow in her life. All she knew was that the wind was howling, the storm was here, and for the first time in years, she was not alone. The storm raged through the night, relentless force that shook the walls of the barn and sent the wind screaming through the cracks in the old timber. Inside the ranch house, Lila sat by the fire, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee gone cold. Sleep had been impossible. Every creak of the house, every distant sound from the barn, had set her nerves on edge. She had spent years hardening herself against fear, but the presence of strangers, warriors, no less just beyond her door, was something she couldn't ignore. Dawn came slowly, the sky still heavy with clouds but no longer pouring its fury onto the earth. Lila rose stiffly from her chair, her body aching from the long night of tension. She moved to the window, pushing aside the faded curtain to peer outside. The barn doors were open, and already she could see movement, figures stepping out into the gray morning light, stretching sore limbs, tending to their horses. They moved with a quiet efficiency, no wasted motion, no loud voices. It was strange to see such discipline in men who were, by all accounts, supposed to be wild and untamed. She knew she couldn't ignore them. Hospitality, even reluctant hospitality, demanded she at least offer food. The thought made her jaw tighten. Supplies were scarce enough without feeding 7 strangers, but turning them away empty-handed after sheltering them felt wrong. With a sigh, she pulled on her coat and stepped outside, the damp earth sinking slightly beneath her boots. The men noticed her immediately, their dark eyes flicking toward her before returning to their tasks. Only one, the leader, the one who had spoken to her last night, straightened and faced her fully. Up close in the daylight, he was even more imposing. His hair was long, tied back with a strip of leather, and his face was all sharp angles and quiet intensity. But there was no threat in his stance, only a watchful patience. Lila cleared her throat. "There's food inside," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "If you're hungry." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly masked. He said something in his own language to the others, and though Lila didn't understand the words, the tone was clear, respectful, measured. The youngest of them, a boy barely old enough to be called a man, grinned openly, his eyes bright with curiosity. The leader, Tohanu, as she would later learn, nodded once. "We thank you," he said simply. Inside, the men were careful. They took only what she offered, ate quietly, and left no mess. The youngest, Koana, even tried to mimic her way of holding a fork, his brow furrowed in concentration until one of the others chuckled and nudged him. Lila found herself watching them more than she meant to. They were so different from the men she knew, the settlers, the traders, even her late husband. There was a stillness to them, a way of being that required no unnecessary words. After the meal, they didn't linger. Tohana spoke again, and the men filed back outside. Lila followed, half expecting them to mount up and ride away now that the storm had passed. But instead, they walked toward the far pasture, where the storm had knocked down a section of fence. Without a word, they set to work. No discussion, no asking permission. Just hands lifting splintered wood, digging new post holes, repairing what the wind had broken. Lila stood frozen in the doorway, her arms crossed against the morning chill. She should have been grateful. Instead, she felt uneasy. Why would they do this? What did they want in return? The stories she'd heard whispered at trading posts and in town rushed back tales of Comanche raids, of settlers vanishing in the night. But these men weren't stealing. They weren't threatening. They were helping. By midday, the fence was sturdy again, better than it had been in years. The men worked with a skill that spoke of lifetimes spent shaping the land to their needs. Lila forced herself to approach, her fingers twisting in the fabric of her skirt. "You didn't have to do that," she said. Tohanu wiped his hands on his leggings, his expression unreadable. "You gave shelter," he said. "We give work." It was the closest thing to fairness she'd encountered in a long time. No bargaining, no hidden debts. Just an exchange of kindness. Lila didn't know what to say. So she nodded, once, and turned back toward the house. But for the first time in years, the weight of her solitude felt less like a shield and more like a burden. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just the fence, not just the storm, but something inside her. The men didn't leave that day. The sky threatened more rain, and the ground was still too soft for easy travel. So they stayed, and Lila let them. And though she told herself it was only practical, only temporary, she couldn't ignore the way her eyes kept straying to Tohanu, wondering what thoughts lay behind those dark, watchful eyes. The uneasy peace that had settled over the ranch shattered, like thin ice beneath a horse's hoof. 3 days had passed since the storm, and though the Comanche men had kept to themselves, sleeping in the barn, repairing what needed mending, hunting game that they shared without being asked, Lila could feel the tension coiling tighter with each sunrise. It wasn't anything they did. It was the way the oldest of them, Chayton, watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, his eyes sharp as a hawk's and just as unreadable. It was the way his fingers lingered near the knife at his belt when he walked past the smokehouse, as if measuring its worth. She should have known it would boil over. It happened at midday, when the sun hung heavy in the sky and the air smelled of damp earth and bruised grass. Lila was in the root cellar, counting jars of preserves precious few after the long winter, when she heard the raised voices. Not shouting, not yet, but the hard-edged tone of men towing the line between words and blows. She emerged into the light just in time to see Chayton shove open the door of the storage shed, his shoulders rigid with anger. Tohanu was half a step behind him, his hand clamped around the older warrior's arm, speaking low and urgent in their language. Lila didn't need to understand the words to know what had happened. The shed was where she kept the seed grain for planting, the last sacks of flour, the things she couldn't afford to lose. And Chayton's expression as he whirled on her was all the confirmation she needed. "You hide food from us," he spat, the accusation thick in his accented English. "We work, we hunt, we share, and you keep your best for yourself." The unfairness of it hit her like a slap. She hadn't hidden anything. What little she had stored away was meant to last until harvest, to keep her alive when the game grew scarce. But the look in Chayton's eyes wasn't just anger, it was hunger, the kind that made men desperate. The kind she knew too well. Lila straightened, her hands curling into fists at her sides. "That's not for eating," she said, her voice tight. "It's for planting. If I feed it to you now, there'll be nothing to sow, nothing to harvest." Chayton's lip curled. "You think we don't know how to live off land? You think we take like thieves? That's enough." Tohana's voice cut through the rising heat like a blade. He stepped between them, his gaze locked on Chayton, speaking in quick, clipped syllables that made the older warrior stiffen. For a heartbeat, Lila thought it might end there, that pride would bow to leadership. Then Chayton snarled something back, low and venomous, and shoved past Tohanu toward the horses. Silence fell like a stone. The other warriors stood frozen, their faces unreadable. Tohanu exhaled sharply through his nose, his jaw working. When he turned to Lila, his eyes were dark with something that might have been apology or frustration or both. "You should go," she said before he could speak. Her throat ached. "All of you. I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for any of it." Tohana studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned to gather his men. Lila told herself it was relief she felt as she watched them prepare to leave. Told herself it was better this way, no more uneasy silences, no more watching eyes. But when the first horse was saddled, a sound cut through the evening air that turned her blood to ice. Wolves. Not the distant howls she sometimes heard at night, but the sharp, guttural snarls of a pack closing in. Her sheep stupid, panicked creatures were already bolting in every direction, their terrified bleats piercing the twilight. Without thinking, Lila grabbed the rifle from beside the door and ran, her boots slipping in the mud. She wasn't fast enough. By the time she reached the pasture, the wolves were already among the flock, 3 of them, lean and ragged with winter hunger. She raised the rifle, her hands shaking, but before she could fire, an arrow whistled past her ear and buried itself in the lead wolf's flank. The Comanche hadn't left. They moved like shadows in the fading light, arrows flying, knives flashing. Tohanu was everywhere, at once dragging a ewe from the jaws of one wolf, driving another back with nothing but his bare hands. It was over in minutes. The wolves, outnumbered and outmatched, slunk away into the gathering dark. Lila stood frozen, the rifle hanging useless at her side. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. The men didn't look at her as they checked the flock, as they carried the one lost lamb back to the barn in silence. Only Tohanu paused beside her, close enough that she could see the sweat on his brow, the quick rise and fall of his chest. "You are leaving," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He met her gaze, his own unreadable. "We do not leave people to wolves." And just like that, the anger drained out of her, leaving behind something raw and aching. She had yelled at them, accused them, and still they had stayed. That night, she didn't eat alone. The men gathered around her table, their quiet voices filling the empty spaces of the house. Chayton didn't apologize, but he didn't glower either, just accepted the plate she handed him with a grunt that might have been thanks. And when Tohanu's fingers brushed hers as she passed him a cup, neither of them pulled away. The days that followed the wolf attack settled into an unspoken rhythm, as if the shared danger had worn down the last sharp edges between them. The Comanche men no longer confined themselves to the barn, moving freely between the pastures and the ranch house with an ease that should have felt intrusive, but somehow didn't. Lila found herself waking each morning to the sound of quiet voices outside her window, to the sight of Coanna grinning as he clumsily mimicked her way of milking the cow, his hands fumbling until one of the older warriors, usually Mapia, who had the patience of a grandmother, showed him the proper way. It was strange, this new normal. Stranger still was how quickly she adapted to it. She had spent so long measuring her days in solitude that the presence of others should have felt like a disruption. Instead, it was as if something inside her had been waiting, without her even realizing it, for the weight of silence to lift. Tohanu was the one who began bridging the gap between their worlds. One evening, as she knelt in the garden pulling weeds, he appeared beside her without a word and began doing the same. His hands were more accustomed to holding a bow than a hoe, but he worked with the same quiet precision he applied to everything. When she glanced at him, questioning, he merely nodded toward the plants. "You grow much here," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Lila wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "Enough to get by, if the weather holds." He studied the neat rows of carrots and beans, the struggling tomato plants she'd nursed through a late frost. "Our people grow too, but different." And just like that, a door opened. That night, after supper, Tohanu brought out a small pouch from his belongings and spilled its contents onto the table seeds, but unlike any Lila had seen before. Some were tiny and dark as pebbles. Others were striped with colors that seemed too vivid to belong in something meant for the earth. "Corn," he said, pointing to the largest kernels.
"Squash. Beans.
They grow together, help each other." Lila picked up one of the striped seeds, rolling it between her fingers. "Three sisters planting," she murmured, remembering a snippet of conversation overheard at the trading post years ago. "I've heard of it, but never seen it done." Tohana's mouth curved, just slightly. "We show you." And they did. The next morning, the men cleared a new patch of land near the creek, where the soil was rich and damp. Ahanu, who seemed to know the land like his own heartbeat, tested the earth with his fingers and nodded approval. Diani and Niall dug the mounds with careful precision, while Coanna, always eager, always grinning, darted back and forth with armfuls of compost from Lila's pile. She watched them work with a growing sense of wonder. This wasn't just planting. It was a kind of alchemy, a way of coaxing life from the ground that felt more like partnership than labor. When she knelt beside Tohanu to press the seeds into their mounds, their shoulders brushing, it occurred to her that she was learning more than just a new way to grow food. She was learning a new way to see the world. The lessons went both ways. The men watched with open curiosity as she kneaded dough for bread, as she stirred the big iron pot of stew over the fire. Chaitin, of all people, turned out to have a sweet tooth, sneaking honey from the jar when he thought no one was looking until Lila caught him and, to her own surprise, laughed aloud. After that, she made sure to leave the honey where he could reach it. But it was Tohanu who sought her out most often. He taught her how to track deer by the slightest bend of a blade of grass, how to read the clouds for more than just rain. In return, she showed him how to mend a torn shirt with stitches so small they nearly vanished, how to tell when milk was on the verge of turning. They spoke in fragments at first, their words groping for meaning across the divide of language and custom. But as the days passed, the spaces between their sentences grew smaller, filled with shared glances, with gestures that needed no translation. One evening, as they sat by the fire outside, the men taking turns telling stories in their own language, their voices rising and falling like music, Lila found herself studying Tohanu's profile in the flickering light. He was listening to Cohanna's animated tale, his expression relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. It made him look younger, softer, human in a way that tightened something in her chest. Mapia caught her staring and smirked, elbowing Niall, who muttered something that made the others chuckle. Tohanu turned to her then, one eyebrow raised in silent question. Lila felt her face grow warm. Nothing, she said too quickly. Just thinking. He held her gaze for a moment longer, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight. Then, very deliberately, he reached over and plucked a stray bit of straw from her hair, letting his fingers linger just a heartbeat too long before pulling away. The men's laughter deepened, but for once, Lila didn't mind. Because Tohanu was smiling to a real smile, small and private and meant only for her. And in that moment, she realized with a jolt that scared her more than any wolf ever could. She didn't want them to leave. Not any of them. Especially not him. The first sign of trouble came not as a sound, but as a silence. Lila was in the barn, mucking out stalls while Koana chattered at her about a young fox he'd seen at the creek's edge, when suddenly the birds outside stopped singing. The absence of their chatter prickled the back of her neck before her mind could put words to the unease. She straightened, the pitchfork frozen in her hands, and met Kohana's suddenly alert gaze. He'd noticed it too. By the time they reached the barn door, the Comanche men were already moving, their relaxed postures from moments before replaced with a coiled readiness of warriors. Tohana stood at the edge of the yard, his head tilted slightly, as if listening to something only he could hear. Then Lila caught at the faint but unmistakable vibration of hoofbeats, too many and coming too fast to be anything friendly. "Riders," Tohana said, the single word slicing through the quiet. "Not ours." The men moved as one, gathering weapons with practiced efficiency. Lila's pulse hammered against her ribs as she sprinted for the house, where her rifle leaned by the door. She'd barely wrapped her fingers around the worn wood when the first shout split the air, a rough, unfamiliar voice bellowing something about squatters and redskins. The outlaws came over the rise like a pack of wild dogs, 6 men on sweat-lathered horses, their clothes stained with trail dust and bad intentions. Lila recognized their type immediately: border ruffians who'd slip between territories to avoid the law, taking what they wanted from whoever couldn't fight back. Their leader, a hulking man with a beard matted with tobacco juice, reined in hard at the sight of the Comanche warriors standing between him and the ranch house. His surprise lasted only a moment before curling into a sneer. "Well now," he drawled, spitting into the dirt, "looks like we found ourselves a regular little love nest. White woman keeping company with savages, that ain't natural." His hand drifted toward the pistol at his hip. "Reckon we'll be taking them horses of yours and whatever else you ain't using proper." Lila felt the words like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Tohanu stepped forward. His voice when he spoke was deceptively calm, but Lila could see the tension in the line of his shoulders. "You will leave." The outlaw's laugh turned into a cough. "Or what, Redskin? You and your—" The gunshot cracked through the air before he finished speaking. Lila didn't see who fired first, only the sudden chaos as horses reared and men shouted. One of the outlaws slumped in his saddle, clutching at his arm where an arrow had found its mark. Then everything happened at once, the outlaws dismounting with curses and drawn weapons, the Comanche warriors moving like shadows between them, knives flashing in the sunlight. Lila raised her rifle, but the combatants were too close together, shifting too quickly for a clean shot. She could only watch in horror as the bearded leader lunged at Tohanu with a Bowie knife, the blade glinting wickedly. Tohanu twisted away, but not fast enough. The steel bit deep into his side as he grappled with the bigger man. A cry tore from Lila's throat as Tohanu went down, the outlaw raising his knife for a killing blow. She didn't remember pulling the trigger. Only the recoil against her shoulder, the acrid smell of gunpowder, and the way the outlaw jerked backward like a puppet with its strings cut, his expression frozen in surprise before he crumpled to the dirt. Silence fell again, heavier this time. The remaining outlaws stared at their fallen leader, then at Lila standing white-faced, with smoke curling from her rifle barrel. One made the sign of the cross, another muttered, which under his breath as they scrambled for their horses. Within moments they were gone, leaving only dust and the moans of their wounded behind. Lila's knees gave out as she reached Tohanu's side. Blood seeped through his fingers where he clutched his side, staining the earth beneath him a dark, terrible red. His breath came in shallow gasps, but his eyes, when they met hers, were clear. "You're hurt," she whispered, her hands fluttering uselessly above the wound. One corner of his mouth twitched upward. "Not dead yet." The others gathered around, their faces grim. Mapia knelt beside them, his skilled hands already examining the injury. "Need fire," he said in his broken English. "Need medicine." Lila nodded, forcing herself to breathe, to think. The wound was bad, she could see that much, but not beyond healing if treated quickly. Her mind raced through the supplies in the house: the whiskey for cleaning, the clean linen for bandages, the yarrow and comfrey she gathered each summer. As she helped carry Tohanu inside, his blood warm against her hands, she realized with sudden, terrifying clarity that she couldn't lose him.
Not now.
Not like this. The hours that followed blurred together: boiling water, stitching flesh, pressing bandages against the wound as Tohanu's skin burned with fever. The other men took turns sitting vigil, their low voices speaking words of encouragement in their own tongue. Lila stayed longest, her fingers tracing idle patterns on Tohanu's wrist when she thought no one was looking, counting each steady beat of his pulse like a promise. Near dawn, when the fever finally broke and Tohanu's breathing evened into sleep, Koana touched her shoulder gently. "You rest," he said, his young face solemn. "We watch." Lila wanted to refuse, but exhaustion dragged at her bones. As she curled into the chair beside the bed, her last thought before sleep took her was the feel of Tohanu's hand in hers, rough and warm and alive, so wonderfully alive, and how right it felt to hold on. The golden light of late afternoon slanted through the cabin window, painting stripes of warmth across the rough-hewn floorboards where Lila stood kneading dough with more force than necessary. 2 weeks had passed since the outlaw attack, and the rhythms of the ranch had settled into a new pattern, one where her footsteps no longer echoed alone through empty rooms, where the sound of male laughter had become as familiar as the creak of the porch steps. Tohana's wound was healing well, though she still caught him pressing a hand to his side sometimes, when he thought no one was looking. The dough beneath her fingers resisted, springing back when she pressed too hard, much like the thoughts she'd been trying to push away. Outside, the men were preparing to leave. She could hear them through the open window: Chayton's gruff instructions, the jingle of tack, Kohana's excited voice, chattering about the hunting grounds they would reach by moonrise. They'd stayed longer than necessary after Tohana's injury, but the prairie grass was greening with spring's full arrival, and the Comanche had their own people to rejoin, their own seasons to follow. Flour puffed into the air as she slammed the dough down harder than needed. A shadow fell across the table, and she didn't need to look up to know it was Tohanu. She could feel his presence like heat from a banked fire, steady, comforting, impossible to ignore. "You're leaving," she said, the words coming out flat and final, as if saying them could make the reality easier to bear. He didn't answer immediately, just leaned against the table, his long fingers tracing a knot in the wood. When she finally dared to meet his gaze, his dark eyes held a question she wasn't sure she was ready to face. "The others go today," he said quietly. "I have not decided." Lila's hands stilled in the dough. Her heart gave a traitorous leap that she quickly tamped down. "What's there to decide? Your people are waiting. Your life is." "Here," he interrupted, so softly she almost didn't hear it. The single word hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Lila's throat tightened. She wanted to reach out, to grasp that word and hold it close, but the fear that had been her constant companion for years rose like a tide. "This isn't your home," she whispered. Tohana straightened, his movements deliberate as he circled the table until he stood close enough that she could see the flecks of amber in his dark eyes, smell the sage and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "Home is not just land," he said, his accented voice rough with emotion. "Home is heart. Family." His calloused hand rose, hovering near her flour-dusted cheek before dropping away. "You are alone too long, Lila." The truth of it struck her like a physical blow. She had been alone not just in the empty years since her husband's death, but long before, in a marriage that had been more practical than passionate, in a life that had been about survival rather than living. The realization left her breathless. Outside, The sounds of departure grew louder. Horses stamped impatiently. Saddlebags were cinched tight. Kohana's voice called something in their language, the words lilting with unspoken meaning. Tohanu's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. Lila looked down at her hands, at the wedding band she still wore though its shine had long since dulled. Slowly, deliberately, she twisted it off and set it on the table. The pale circle it left on her finger felt strangely light, as if she'd shed a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying. When she looked up, Tohanu's expression was unreadable. "What does this mean?" he asked, nodding toward the abandoned ring. Lila drew a shaky breath. "It means, I need to know what you're asking me." For the first time since she'd known him, Tohanu looked uncertain. His fingers flexed at his sides before he spoke. "Come with us. Not as guest. Not as white woman living at edge of our camp." His voice dropped to a whisper. "As my wife. As family." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Somewhere beyond the walls of the cabin, a meadowlark sang its liquid song, oblivious to the momentous shift occurring inside. Lila thought of all the reasons she should say no, the uncertainty, the fear, the sheer impossibility of leaving everything familiar behind. Then she thought of waking each morning to this man's quiet strength, of learning the stories written in the stars as his people knew them, of no longer eating supper alone. Her hand found his, their fingers intertwining like roots, seeking the same rich soil. "Yes," she said, the word barely more than an exhale. Tohanu's smile could have lit the darkest night. Outside, as if sensing the decision, the men who had become her unlikely family began to sing a deep, rolling chant of celebration that carried on the spring breeze. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Lila didn't feel afraid of what came next. The morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of day that made the prairie seem endless under the vast blue sky. Lila stood by the packed wagon, her fingers tracing the familiar grooves of the wooden bench where she'd sat so many times before, only this time she wouldn't be returning. The ranch she'd poured years of sweat and loneliness into stood silent behind her, its doors latched, its pastures empty save for the few sheep she'd gifted to neighbors. Everything that mattered now was either loaded into the wagon or mounted on horseback, waiting. Tohanu moved beside her, his shoulder brushing hers as he adjusted the straps holding her trunk in place. Even now, after weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, the simple nearness of him sent warmth spreading through her chest. He caught her staring and raised an eyebrow, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Ready?" The question was heavier than it sounded. Ready to leave the only home she'd known? Ready to ride into a life so different it might as well be another world? Lila glanced back at the cabin one last time, at the vegetable garden just beginning to green, at the barn where 7 strangers had once taken shelter from a storm. The ache of leaving was there, but it was duller than she'd expected, overshadowed by something brighter: anticipation, curiosity, the thrill of stepping into the unknown without being alone. She took a deep breath and nodded. Ready. The journey stretched over days that blurred together in a haze of sunlit trails and campfire nights. Lila learned the rhythm of travel: when to rest the horses, how to pack a bedroll so the rocks didn't dig into her back, which plants along the trail could soothe tired feet or season a meal. The men, who had once been wary strangers, now treated her with an easy familiarity, teasing her about her stiff riding posture or showing her how to spot rabbit trails in the underbrush. Koana, ever exuberant, appointed himself her unofficial guide, pointing out landmarks with the pride of a seasoned explorer. And Tohanu always near, always watching, his presence as steady as the horizon. When they finally crested the rise overlooking the Comanche encampment, Lila's breath caught in her throat. Dozens of hide lodges dotted the valley below, smoke curling from their peaks like lazy serpents. Children darted between them, their laughter carrying on the wind, while women worked over fires or stretched hides on frames. Horses grazed in a nearby meadow, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. It was alive in a way the solitary ranch had never been, pulsing with movement and community. A cry went up as they were spotted, and suddenly people were streaming toward them calling greetings, embracing the returning warriors, their curious eyes flicking to Lila with interest, but not hostility. An older woman with streaks of silver in her braids stepped forward, her sharp eyes assessing Lila before turning to Tohanu with a rapid string of words. His response made her eyebrows shoot up, then a slow smile spread across her face as she reached for Lila's hands. "Mothers always know," Mapia muttered from behind them, earning chuckles from the others. The days that followed were a whirlwind of new faces, new customs, new ways of being. Lila learned to grind corn between stones until her arms ached, to stitch beads onto leather with patterns that told stories, to distinguish between the dozens of plants the women gathered for food and medicine. There were moments of awkwardness, of course times when she fumbled a task or misunderstood a tradition, but no one mocked her. Instead, they corrected gently, their patience as endless as the prairie sky. At night, wrapped in buffalo robes beside Tohanu under a canopy of stars, she would whisper her discoveries to him, how the children had taught her a game played with sticks and stones, how the women had laughed when she tried to mimic their dancing, how the taste of meat roasted over an open fire seemed richer here, seasoned with camaraderie as much as herbs. "You are happy," Tohanu observed one evening, not as a question but as a statement of fact. Lila rolled onto her side to study his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his nose, the curve of his mouth, the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks when he blinked. She thought of the ranch, of the silence she'd endured for so long, of the way her heart now felt too big for her chest whenever the camp erupted into song or laughter. "Yes," she said simply, because no other word could contain it. Tohanu's hand found hers under the robes, their fingers intertwining. Around them, the night hummed with crickets and distant voices, with the occasional nicker of horses and the crackle of dying fires. It wasn't quiet, but it was peaceful, a different kind of stillness, one filled with life instead of absence. Lila closed her eyes, breathing it all in. This was her life now. This was her home. And as the fire burned low and the stars wheeled overhead, she knew she wouldn't have chosen any other path. Did you enjoy Lila and Tohanu's journey? Subscribe for more heartfelt tales of love, adventure, and second chances on the frontier. Every news story is a chance to discover another world. Click follow so you never miss a chapter. Your support helps bring these characters to life. Which part moved you most? Let us know in the comments.